In the spring of 1887 AD, an Egyptian farmer digging in the ruins of an abandoned desert city discovered something extraordinary: a cache of clay tablets covered in an ancient script. Within months, these fragments would reveal frantic diplomatic letters sent from foreign kings begging a pharaoh for help that never came. The tablets came from a place called Amarna, and they told the story of an empire crumbling while its king pursued a vision that would shake Egyptian civilization to its core. When archaeologists first excavated Amarna in the late 19th century, they found a city that had been deliberately abandoned. Streets ended abruptly. Palaces stood half-finished. Temples, unlike any others in Egypt, had no roofs, designed to let sunlight pour directly onto the altars within. The site was peculiar in every sense. While most Egyptian cities were built near established centres of power, Amarna sat isolated in the desert of Middle Egypt, equidistant between the great capitals of Memphis and Thebes. It was as if someone had decided to start Egyptian civilization over from scratch, and in a way that's exactly what had happened. Before this city rose and fell, Egypt had been the superpower of the ancient world. The reign of Amenhotep III had brought unprecedented wealth to the Nile Valley. Gold flowed from Nubian mines. Trade routes stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. At Thebes, the temple complex of Karnak sprawled across acres of land, its pylons rising like artificial mountains against the desert sky. The priests of Amun, the king of gods, controlled resources that would make them almost as powerful as the pharaoh himself. Yet their hymns echoed through columned halls each dawn. Their rituals had been performed, unchanged, for generations beyond counting. Egypt's religious landscape was vast and stable, a pantheon so ancient that even Egyptians themselves could not remember when their gods had first been worshipped. Into this world of certainty stepped Amenhotep IV. At first, there was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The young prince had been raised in the shadow of his father's magnificence, surrounded by priests, diplomats, and the rhythms of palace life at Thebes. Egypt was prosperous. The international order was secure. The gods seemed satisfied. But within 5 years of taking the throne, this pharaoh would do something that stunned his contemporaries and baffled historians for millennia afterward. Yet he would attempt to erase Egypt's gods, not through military conquest, not through foreign invasion, but through an act of will so radical that later generations would refuse to speak his name, striking him from the official record as if he had never existed. The abandoned city at Amarna was the physical remnant of that attempt, a capital built for a god that Egypt rejected, ruled by a king that Egypt tried to forget. Those clay tablets discovered in 1887 AD were called the Amarna letters, and they revealed something troubling. While the pharaoh was revolutionizing religion at home, his empire abroad was falling apart. Vassal kings in Canaan and Syria sent message after desperate message. Armies were approaching, cities were under siege, enemies were advancing. The letters went unanswered, temples closed, priests lost their positions. The old gods were banned from public worship, and in their place stood a single symbol, a sun disk with rays ending in tiny hands, reaching down to touch the royal family. The pharaoh had changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declared that this solar disk was not merely supreme among gods, but the only god worthy of worship. For 17 years, Egypt existed in this revolutionary state. Then Akhenaten died, and almost overnight, everything he had built began to crumble. The new pharaoh, a boy named Tutankhamun, moved the capital back to Thebes. The temples reopened, the old gods returned to their shrines, and the city of Amarna was abandoned to the desert winds, its stones quarried away, its memory deliberately erased. Later, kings would refer to Akhenaten only as the criminal of Amarna. His name was chiselled from monuments. His statues were smashed. Official king lists skipped over his reign entirely, as if those 17 years had simply never occurred. But the attempt to forget him preserved his importance. The very violence of the erasure testified to how deeply he had shaken Egyptian civilization. And when modern archaeologists unearthed Amarna's ruins, they discovered not just a failed religious experiment, but evidence of a transformation that would echo through history. Because while Akhenaten's revolution collapsed almost as quickly as it began, the questions it raised about divine authority, religious power, and the relationship between ruler and god would reshape political and spiritual thought across the ancient world. This is the story of the pharaoh who tried to redefine eternity and instead accidentally changed history forever. If you're enjoying this piece, consider subscribing to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more people discover these forgotten moments when single decisions reshaped civilization. Today, we journey to the 18th dynasty of Egypt's New Kingdom, to a time when the richest empire in the ancient world stood at the height of its power, and one man's spiritual awakening would bring it to the edge of collapse. Let me take you back to a world of temple hymns and diplomatic intrigue, to the golden age that preceded the storm, and show you how Egypt's stability became its vulnerability when a revolutionary sat on the throne. To understand how radically Akhenaten would transform Egypt, we first need to see what he inherited, a civilization so ancient, so wealthy, and so religiously complex that it seemed unshakable. Picture Thebes at dawn during the reign of Amenhotep III. As sunlight breaks over the eastern hills, the Nile reflects gold across the floodplains. Farmers wade into irrigation channels. Fishermen cast nets into waters thick with life. Along the river's edge, mud brick houses cluster in the shadow of structures built not for humans but for gods. The temple complex at Karnak dominates the landscape. Its massive pylons, gateway towers built from millions of sandstone blocks, rise higher than any tree that grows along the Nile. Beyond them stretch courtyards vast enough to hold thousands of worshippers. Deeper still stand the columned halls, their ceilings supported by pillars as thick as ancient oaks, carved with hieroglyphs recounting divine victories and royal offerings. Every morning, priests perform rituals that had been performed for centuries. They purify themselves in sacred pools. They dress the statue of Amun, king of the gods, in fine linen. They present offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense. They chant hymns that echo through stone corridors, voices layered upon voices, the same words their grandfathers' grandfathers had sung. This was religious life in Egypt, not the worship of one god, but of hundreds. Ra governed the sun, Osiris ruled the dead, Hathor brought love and joy, Thoth presided over wisdom and writing, Ptah was patron of craftsmen. Each nome, each administrative district had its own local deities. Each profession, each aspect of life, each fear and hope had a divine protector. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes had grown wealthy beyond measure. They controlled vast estates. They collected taxes from temple lands. They managed workshops, granaries, livestock, ships. The high priest of Amun was second only to the pharaoh in influence, and sometimes rivaled him. Under Amenhotep III, Egypt had reached a zenith that would be remembered as its golden age. The pharaoh's palace at Malkata sprawled across the western bank of the Nile, a complex of halls and gardens cooled by artificial lakes. At Luxor, new temples rose alongside ancient shrines. Colossal statues were erected, images of the king as tall as buildings, designed to endure until the end of time. Beyond Egypt's borders, the empire's reach was uncontested. Nubia to the south provided gold that financed monumental construction. Syria and Canaan sent tribute. Diplomatic letters arrived from Babylonia, from the Mitanni kingdom, from Hittite princes, all addressing Amenhotep as brother, as equal, as the most powerful ruler in the known world. Egypt exported grain, linen, papyrus and gold. In return came cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, horses from Asia. Trade routes functioned smoothly, border fortresses stood secure. The international order seemed permanent. This was the world that appeared eternal, a religious system refined over millennia, an economy of staggering wealth, a political structure that had survived invasion, drought, and internal strife. Egypt had outlasted empires that rose and fell around it. Its gods had proven their power through Egypt's endurance. Records show that Amenhotep III ruled for 38 years. Inscriptions describe his reign as one of peace and prosperity. He built more monuments than almost any pharaoh before him. When he died, he left his son an empire at the peak of its strength. The question that would haunt historians for centuries afterward was this: how could such a stable system, refined over 2,000 years, supported by immense wealth, defended by an entrenched priesthood, and woven into every aspect of Egyptian life, be overturned by a single king? How could one man nearly dismantle what generations had built? The answer begins with the young prince who inherited this golden age. Amenhotep IV received the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt around 1353 BC. Contemporary records describe a traditional coronation. The proper rituals were observed. The gods were honoured. The new pharaoh made offerings at the expected temples. Nothing about his early reign suggested the upheaval to come, but within the palace at Thebes, something was stirring. The young king had begun to pay unusual attention to a relatively minor solar deity, a god represented not in human or animal form, but as a simple disk, the Aten. Amenhotep IV was not raised to be a revolutionary. He grew up in the most luxurious court the ancient world had ever seen, surrounded by courtiers who spoke in careful, diplomatic language, priests who performed rituals with precision refined over generations, and scribes who recorded everything according to traditions that stretched back to the age of the pyramids. His father, Amenhotep III, was a living god who had reigned since before the prince was born, as the elder pharaoh had transformed Thebes into a showcase of imperial power. He had married a commoner named Tiaye, a woman of remarkable intelligence who would become one of Egypt's most influential queens, and together they had presided over an era of unprecedented peace. For a prince growing up in this environment, the future seemed predetermined. He would learn the traditional arts of kingship, how to perform rituals that maintained cosmic order, how to receive foreign ambassadors, how to commission monuments that would immortalize his reign. He would honour the gods his ancestors had honoured. He would maintain the system that had made Egypt great. But something in the young prince's upbringing set him apart. Queen Tiye was no ordinary royal consort. Unlike previous queens, who remained largely ceremonial, had she appeared in official inscriptions alongside her husband. Foreign kings addressed diplomatic correspondence to her directly. She attended state functions and influenced policy decisions. Some scholars suggest she fostered in her son an independence of thought uncommon among Egyptian princes. The political landscape of the late 18th dynasty was more complex than it appeared. Beneath the surface of prosperity, tensions simmered between royal authority and priestly power. The temples of Amun had accumulated so much wealth that they functioned almost as a parallel government. The high priest of Amun controlled estates across Egypt, commanded thousands of workers, and wielded influence that could rival the throne itself. Previous pharaohs had managed this balance carefully. They made generous donations to Amun's temples, they participated enthusiastically in traditional festivals, and allowed the priesthood its privileges. In return, the priests legitimized royal authority by presenting the pharaoh as Amun's chosen representative on earth. But this arrangement also created a dependency. The pharaoh needed the priesthood's endorsement. His divine right to rule flowed through Amun. His power was shared, not absolute. Whether the young Amenhotep resented this constraint or simply developed different spiritual convictions remains one of history's great mysteries. Later propaganda, both his own and that of his enemies, makes it impossible to know his true motivations. Did he experience a genuine religious awakening? Was he a political opportunist who saw monotheism as a path to consolidated power? Or did ideology and ambition intertwine so thoroughly that even he couldn't separate them? What inscriptions do reveal is that solar theology was not entirely foreign to Egyptian religion. Ra, the sun god, had been worshipped since the Old Kingdom. The Aten, the physical disk of the sun, appeared in religious texts as an aspect of Ra's divine power. During his father's reign, hymns occasionally celebrated the Aten's life-giving rays. But these were minor themes in a vast religious symphony. The Aten was one voice among hundreds, certainly not the dominant deity of the empire. Somewhere during his youth or early reign, Amenhotep IV began to see things differently. Perhaps it started with philosophical questions about the nature of divinity. Perhaps it emerged from meditation on the sun's universal power, how it shone on Egypt and foreign lands alike, how it gave life to all creation without distinction. Perhaps he was influenced by foreign religious concepts encountered through Egypt's extensive diplomatic network. Or perhaps he simply looked at the immense wealth and political power concentrated in Amun's temples and decided that no institution should rival the pharaoh's authority. Whatever the catalyst, the change began subtly. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV authorized the construction of several temples to the Aten at Karnak, inside the very heart of Amun's religious complex. These structures were unlike traditional Egyptian temples. Instead of dark inner sanctuaries where only priests could enter, they featured open courtyards that allowed sunlight to flood the sacred spaces. The architecture itself made a statement. The sun disk needed no enclosed shrine. It was visible to all. Its power required no priestly intermediaries. At first, these additions seemed like the conventional piety of a new pharaoh honouring various deities. Egypt's religious landscape was accommodating. One more god-receiving temples was hardly revolutionary. But the inscriptions accompanying these structures contained unusual language. They describe the Aten not merely as one god among many, but as the source of all life, the creator of all peoples, the singular divine force behind existence itself. The priests of Amun watched these developments with growing unease. The new pharaoh was spending resources on the Aten that might have gone to Amun's temples, but he was commissioning hymns that elevated this solar disk above traditional deities. He was beginning to speak of the Aten in terms that suggested exclusivity. And then, in the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV did something unprecedented. He abandoned the name his father had given him, a name that meant Amun is satisfied, and took a new identity that would define his reign and echo through history. He became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. The revolution had begun. In ancient Egypt, names carried power. A person's name was more than identification. It was part of their soul, their essence, their connection to the divine order. To speak someone's name was to give them life in the afterworld. To erase a name was to obliterate existence itself. When Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, and he wasn't simply adopting a new title, he was performing an act of spiritual and political defiance that would have shocked everyone who witnessed it. The meaning was unmistakable. Effective for the Aten replaced Amun is satisfied. With a single gesture, the pharaoh had removed Egypt's most powerful god from his own royal identity and replaced him with a deity most Egyptians barely recognized. But Akhenaten didn't stop at his own name. He ordered the systematic removal of Amun's name from monuments throughout Egypt. Stone carvers climbed temple walls with chisels, erasing hieroglyphs that had stood for centuries. The god's name was hacked out of inscriptions, sometimes so thoroughly that the stone itself was damaged. Even his father's monuments were not spared. Anywhere Amun appeared, it was obliterated. And this was desecration on a scale Egypt had never witnessed. The priesthood of Amun watched their god's identity being literally chiselled away from the historical record. Their protests, if they voiced any, went unrecorded or were deliberately suppressed. Then came the economic blow. Akhenaten began redirecting temple wealth away from Amun's institutions and toward the Aten. Offerings that had traditionally gone to Karnak now went to the new Aten temples. Resources that had supported thousands of priests, workers, and temple dependents were reassigned. The elaborate festivals honouring Amun, celebrations that had brought pilgrims and commerce to Thebes for generations, were curtailed or abandoned. The Theban priesthood found itself in an impossible position. They had legitimised every pharaoh for centuries, presenting each king as Amun's chosen representative. Now the king himself was dismantling their god's supremacy. To oppose him openly would be to challenge divine authority. To remain silent was to watch their power evaporate. Meanwhile, Akhenaten was constructing a new theology to replace the old. The hymns composed during this period reveal a radical reimagining of divinity. The Aten was described as a universal creator whose power extended beyond Egypt's borders. One hymn proclaimed, "You are in my heart, and there is no other who knows you except your son Akhenaten. You have made him wise in your ways and your power." This was revolutionary language. Traditional Egyptian theology allowed for many gods with overlapping domains and regional variations. The Aten theology suggested something different, a single divine force, omnipresent and supreme, with the pharaoh as its sole earthly interpreter. Artistically, the transformation was equally dramatic. Where Egyptian gods had always been depicted in human or animal form, Amun as a man with a ram's head, Horus as a falcon, Anubis as a jackal. The Aten appeared only as a solar disk. From this disk extended rays, each ending in a tiny hand. These hands reached down to touch the royal family, offering the Ankh symbol of life directly to the king and queen. The imagery conveyed a clear message. The Aten's power flowed exclusively through Akhenaten. No priests needed to intercede. No temples needed to house hidden statues. No elaborate rituals were required. The sun shone on all creation, but only the royal family could channel its divine authority. This theological restructuring centralized spiritual power in ways that would have been unthinkable under the old system. Where once dozens of priesthoods across Egypt claimed direct access to divine will, now only one person did, Akhenaten himself. The political implications were staggering. By elevating the Aten above all other gods, Akhenaten had effectively eliminated the religious establishment's leverage over the throne. The priests of Amun could no longer claim to mediate between gods and king. Their temples, their wealth, their influence, all of it suddenly became irrelevant to the new cosmic order. But Akhenaten faced a practical problem. As long as he remained in Thebes, he was surrounded by Amun's monuments, Amun's priests, Amun's traditions. The old religious infrastructure dominated the landscape. Every street led to a shrine. Every festival celebrated the traditional gods. The weight of centuries pressed against his revolution. He needed a clean slate, a place where the Aten could be worshipped without the shadow of the old gods, a city built from nothing according to his vision, free from the accumulated traditions that constrained him in Thebes. In the 6th year of his reign, Akhenaten made an announcement that would cement his break with the past. He was abandoning Thebes. He was leaving Memphis. He was rejecting every established centre of power in Egypt. Instead, he would build an entirely new capital in the desert, a city dedicated solely to the Aten, where his religious revolution could flourish without interference from the old order. He called this city Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. We know it as Amarna. And the site Akhenaten chose for his new capital was a virgin stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt. No previous pharaoh had built there. No temples to the old gods stood on the land. No traditions had taken root in the sand. It was perfect. Akhenaten marked the boundaries of his new city with massive stone stelae, monumental inscriptions carved into the cliff faces surrounding the site. These boundary markers recorded his oath never to expand beyond the limits he had set, never to be buried outside this sacred territory, and never to allow anyone to persuade him to abandon his vision. The inscriptions reveal something of his mindset. He claimed the site had been revealed to him by the Aten itself, that no god or goddess had any prior claim to this land, and that it belonged exclusively to his solar deity. Or it was as if he was establishing not just a new city, but a new world, separate from Egypt's past, unsullied by the old religious order. Construction began at a pace that must have strained Egypt's resources. Thousands of workers were mobilized. Stone was quarried. Mud bricks were moulded by the millions. Within just a few years, a functioning capital rose from the desert floor. The city's layout reflected Akhenaten's revolutionary theology. At its heart stood the great temple of the Aten. But unlike any temple Egypt had known, traditional temples were designed as progressively darker, more enclosed spaces, culminating in a hidden sanctuary where only the high priest could approach the god's statue. The great temple of the Aten had no roof. Sunlight flooded its courtyards, unobstructed. Hundreds of offering tables stood in the open air, receiving the Aten's rays directly. Nearby rose the small Aten temple and the royal palace, connected by a bridge that allowed the royal family to move between religious and administrative spaces. The architecture emphasized openness and light, a physical manifestation of the theology that sunlight itself was divine presence. But perhaps the most striking transformation was artistic. Egyptian art had followed rigid conventions for over 1,000 years. Pharaohs were always depicted as idealized, ageless warriors with perfect proportions. Queens appeared as eternally youthful beauties. The human form was standardized, symbolic rather than realistic. Amarna art shattered these conventions. Akhenaten commissioned portraits that showed him with an elongated face, full lips, a protruding belly, and wide hips. As some scholars have suggested, these images reflected actual physical characteristics, possibly from a medical condition. Others argue they were intentionally stylized to emphasize his unique relationship with the divine, neither fully masculine nor feminine, but somehow transcendent. His wife, Nefertiti, appeared in these reliefs with unprecedented prominence. She was shown worshipping the Aten alongside Akhenaten, performing rituals traditionally reserved for pharaohs, even smiting enemies in poses usually exclusive to kings. Her famous limestone bust, discovered millennia later and now housed in Berlin, captures the elegant beauty that made her name mean the beautiful one has come. Images of the royal family showed them in intimate domestic scenes, playing with their daughters, kissing, embracing. This too was revolutionary. Egyptian royal art had always emphasized divine kingship and eternal authority. Now it displayed human affection and vulnerability. The entire aesthetic suggested a break with the past, a new way of seeing, representing, and understanding the world. But while Akhenaten was building his utopian capital, the empire his father had so carefully maintained was beginning to fracture. Moving the government from Thebes to an undeveloped desert site disrupted administrative continuity. Experienced officials who had served in established capitals now found themselves in a construction zone. The infrastructure for managing an empire, archives, messenger systems, diplomatic protocols, had to be rebuilt from scratch. Foreign affairs, which required constant attention and delicate diplomacy, suffered from this dislocation. Egypt's network of vassal states stretched from Nubia to Syria, each requiring regular communication, dispute resolution, and occasional military support to maintain stability. As Akhenaten focused on religious transformation at home, those international relationships began to strain. In the royal archive at Akhetaten, clay tablets arrived with increasing urgency. They came from Byblos, from Jerusalem, from cities in Canaan and Syria. They carried diplomatic correspondence written in Akkadian cuneiform, the international language of the ancient Near East, and they all said essentially the same thing. Help was needed. Threats were emerging. Enemies were advancing. Egypt's attention was required. But Egypt's attention was elsewhere. The clay tablets discovered at Amarna in 1887 AD provide a window into an empire in distress. These letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform and preserved by the desert's dry conditions, form one of the most remarkable diplomatic archives from the ancient world. They reveal conversations between Egypt and its neighbours during the exact years when Akhenaten was revolutionizing religion at home. What they show is troubling. Rib-Hadda, ruler of the coastal city of Byblos, sent letter after desperate letter, His messages grew increasingly frantic over the years. Neighbouring territories were being seized by rivals. His own city was under threat. He pleaded for troops, for supplies, for any sign that Egypt still protected its vassals. To the king, my lord and my son, message of Ribhadda, your servant. May the king, my lord, be informed that the war against me is severe. Another letter. I have written repeatedly to the palace, but my words have not been heard. When will the king send archers to me? And another. Now I am dwelling in one small house with the people of my city, and they are dying of famine. The responses, if there were any, have not survived. From Jerusalem, a local ruler named Abdi Heber sent similar pleas. He reported that territories were being lost, that Egyptian influence was collapsing, that without immediate military intervention, the entire region would slip from Pharaoh's control. These were not exaggerated complaints from paranoid vassals. Something fundamental was shifting in the international order. To the north, the Hittite kingdom under Suppiluliuma I had grown increasingly aggressive. For generations, Egypt and the Hittites had maintained a careful balance of power across Syria and Canaan. Egyptian diplomacy and occasional military demonstrations had kept the Hittites at a respectful distance, but Suppiluliuma recognized an opportunity. The pharaoh who had once sent expeditions to secure Egyptian interests was now preoccupied with domestic religious transformation. Egyptian garrisons went unreinforced. Diplomatic disputes went unresolved. The impression of Egyptian weakness invited challenges. Hittite forces began expanding into territories that had been within Egypt's sphere of influence. Client kingdoms that had once looked to Thebes for protection now reconsidered their allegiances. Some switched sides. Others tried to play both powers against each other. The careful diplomatic network that Amenhotep III had constructed over decades began to unravel. This was not conquest through direct invasion. It was erosion through neglect, a gradual hemorrhaging of influence that occurred while Egypt's attention was directed elsewhere. The military establishment too faced disruption. Egypt's army had traditionally been led by experienced generals who campaigned regularly to maintain Egyptian prestige. But Akhenaten showed little interest in military affairs. Inscriptions from his reign barely mention warfare. No records describe him leading troops into battle or celebrating military victories. Instead, the artistic record from Amarna shows the royal family worshipping the Aten, receiving tribute, and participating in religious ceremonies. The traditional iconography of the pharaoh as triumphant warrior, central to Egyptian royal identity, was notably absent. The contrast could not have been starker. While Akhenaten closed temples at home, in Egypt's temples abroad, the client states and vassal kingdoms that formed the empire's outer structure were crumbling without support. The irony was profound. Akhenaten's father had left him the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Trade routes were secure, borders were stable, foreign kings addressed Egypt with respect, verging on submission. Gold flowed from Nubian mines. Tribute arrived from Syria and Canaan. The international system functioned smoothly because Egypt had spent generations building and maintaining it. That system required constant attention. It needed diplomatic correspondence, regular military demonstrations, quick responses to emerging threats, and the projection of strength even when not actively campaigning. Akhenaten provided none of this. His revolution demanded his focus. His new city required his attention. Yet his theological transformation consumed his energy. And so as temples to the old gods fell silent in Egypt, the sounds of Egyptian authority grew fainter in foreign lands as well. Yet within Amarna itself, the revolution appeared to be succeeding. The city was complete. The Aten temples stood open to the sky. The royal family presided over a court that had fully embraced the new theology. Hymns to the Aten were composed and performed. Artists created works in the revolutionary new style. Officials adopted the religious language their king demanded. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Akhenaten had achieved his vision. He had broken the power of the old priesthood. He had built a capital free from traditional constraints. He had elevated the Aten to supreme status. He had, in effect, made himself the singular channel through which divine authority flowed to Egypt. The system he created was radical, unprecedented, and utterly dependent on his personal authority to sustain it. What he had built would stand only as long as he did. By the middle years of Akhenaten's reign, the religious revolution had reached its zenith. The suppression of traditional worship was no longer subtle. Temples across Egypt stood closed, their priesthoods disbanded, their rituals abandoned. The names of gods were systematically erased from public monuments. Even in private tombs, artisans were instructed to remove references to deities other than the Aten. The transformation went beyond mere preference. This was religious exclusivity enforced through royal decree, something Egypt had never experienced in its thousands of years of civilization. So Amarna, the royal family, had become the exclusive intermediaries between heaven and earth. Images throughout the city showed Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters receiving the Aten's rays. Only they stood beneath the sun disk's hands. Only they could channel divine blessing to the rest of humanity. This was a radical departure from Egyptian tradition, where priests across the kingdom claimed direct access to various gods, where local shrines served community needs, where religious authority was distributed among thousands of practitioners. Now all spiritual power flowed through one family, in one city, worshipping one God. The theological statement reached its fullest expression in a composition known as the Great Hymn to the Aten. Whether Akhenaten authored it himself or merely commissioned it remains debated, but the text reveals the revolution's core ideology. You rise beautifully in the horizon of heaven, living Aten, creator of life. You are beautiful, great, dazzling, high over every land. Your rays encompass the lands to the limit of all that you have made. The hymn described the Aten as a universal creator whose power extended beyond Egypt to all peoples and all lands. It celebrated the sun's daily journey, its life-giving properties, its role in sustaining all creation. Everything that lived did so because of the Aten's benevolence. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this constituted true monotheism, the belief that only one God exists, or henotheism, the worship of one supreme God while acknowledging others might exist. The distinction matters because if Akhenaten's theology was genuinely monotheistic, it would predate similar developments in other ancient traditions by centuries. The evidence suggests something complex. Akhenaten didn't simply claim the Aten was supreme among many gods. He actively suppressed worship of other deities, erased their names, and closed their temples. This went beyond preference to approach denial of their existence, or at least their legitimacy. Yet some texts from Amarna still mentioned other gods in passing, suggesting complete theological clarity remained elusive even within the revolution itself. What's undeniable is that this theology transformed Egyptian culture in fundamental ways. Burial customs, which had remained relatively stable for over 1,000 years, suddenly shifted. Traditional funerary texts invoked Osiris as lord of the underworld, describing the deceased's journey through his realm and judgment before his throne. These texts disappeared from tombs at Amarna. Osiris imagery, so central to Egyptian concepts of the afterlife, was suppressed. Instead, tombs at Amarna showed the deceased worshipping the Aten through the intermediary of the royal family. The afterlife itself was reimagined as eternal existence, under the sun disk's rays rather than passage through Osiris's underworld. For a civilization that had built its entire understanding of death around Osiris and his realm, this was profoundly disorienting. Ordinary Egyptians faced the terrifying possibility that the funerary practices their ancestors had followed for millennia might no longer ensure their survival after death. The exclusivity extended to all aspects of religious life. Private shrines to household gods, small personal spaces where families had traditionally sought protection and blessing, fell silent or were hidden. Amulets invoking protective deities became dangerous to possess. The spiritual landscape that had given structure and comfort to daily life was systematically dismantled. For approximately 17 years, this system persisted. Akhenaten ruled from Amarna, maintaining his theological vision through the force of royal authority. The Aten temples remained open to the sky. The royal family continued to appear as the exclusive channels of divine power, but the entire structure rested on a single point of failure: the king himself. His authority held the revolution together. His vision gave it direction. His will suppressed opposition. Without him, yet there was no institutional structure to sustain what he had built. The priesthood he had created was small and dependent on royal patronage. The theology had no deep roots in Egyptian tradition. The capital itself was only a few years old. Everything depended on Akhenaten's continued reign. Around 1336 BC, in the 17th year of his rule, that reign ended. Akhenaten died. The circumstances remain unclear. Perhaps illness, perhaps simply the passage of time. He was buried somewhere near Amarna, though his final resting place has never been definitively identified. With his death, the revolution he had built began to collapse almost immediately. The question Egypt now faced was stark. Would his vision survive him, or would 2,000 years of tradition reassert itself the moment his personal authority vanished? The answer would come swiftly and brutally. The succession after Akhenaten's death remains shrouded in confusion, a confusion that may itself reflect the chaos of the moment. A shadowy figure named Smenkhkare appears briefly in the historical record, possibly reigning for a year or less. Some scholars suggest this was a co-regent during Akhenaten's final years. Others propose Smenkhkare was actually Nefertiti ruling under a different name. The evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. What's clear is that within a year or two of Akhenaten's death, power passed to a child. Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, was perhaps 8 or 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He may have been Akhenaten's son, though the precise family relationships remain debated. Regardless of his parentage, this boy inherited an empire in crisis and a religious revolution that was already beginning to unravel. He was far too young to rule independently. Real power rested with advisors, particularly a general named Horemheb and an official named Ai, who would later become Pharaoh himself. These men had lived through Akhenaten's revolution. They had witnessed the disruption it caused. and they moved quickly to reverse it. Within 3 years of taking the throne, the young king issued what's now called the Restoration Stela, a document that reveals the state Egypt had fallen into during the Aten supremacy. The inscription described temples throughout Egypt lying desolate. Shrines had become overgrown with weeds. Sanctuaries were treated as footpaths, trampled and forgotten. The gods, it claimed, had turned their backs on Egypt. When armies were sent abroad, they met with no success. When the gods were petitioned, they did not respond. Whether this description was accurate or propaganda designed to justify the counter-revolution hardly matters. What's significant is that the new regime felt the need to explain why they were abandoning Akhenaten's vision. And their explanation was that his theology had brought catastrophe. The reversal was systematic and swift. Temples to the traditional gods reopened across Egypt. Priests were recalled. Rituals that had been banned for nearly 2 decades resumed. The wealth that Akhenaten had redirected to the Aten was returned to the old institutions. Amun of Thebes was restored to his position as king of gods. The court abandoned Amarna. Officials packed archives and returned to Thebes and Memphis, the traditional centres of power where infrastructure, established networks, and institutional memory still existed. The desert city that Akhenaten had built as his sacred capital was left to the sand. Even the young pharaoh's name was changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The transformation was symbolic and absolute. The god Akhenaten had tried to erase from history was now written into the king's own identity. Inscriptions began appearing that condemned the Aten period without naming Akhenaten directly. They spoke of a time of chaos, of religious impropriety, of divine anger. The message was clear. What had happened during those 17 years was an aberration, a mistake that Egypt needed to forget. The emotional weight of this reversal is difficult to fully grasp. An entire generation had grown up under Atenism. Children born in Amarna had known no other religious system. Artists had trained in the new style. Officials had built careers serving Akhenaten's vision. Priests of the Aten had devoted their lives to this theology. All of it. The temples, the hymns, the artistic revolution, the theological restructuring was being systematically dismantled and declared illegitimate. For those who had believed in Akhenaten's vision, the collapse must have been devastating. The god they had worshipped exclusively was being suppressed. The king they had followed was being erased from memory. The city they had built was being abandoned to decay. Yet for those who had suffered under the revolution, priests who had lost positions, her communities whose local shrines had been closed, diplomats who had watched the empire crumble, the restoration may have felt like liberation. Egypt was returning to what it knew. The old gods were coming home. Tutankhamun died young, perhaps around age 18, after ruling for only about 9 years. His tomb, discovered nearly intact in 1922 AD, would make him the most famous pharaoh in modern times, though he was relatively insignificant in his own era. His true historical importance lies not in what he built, but in what he dismantled. Under his nominal rule, guided by powerful advisors, Egypt systematically erased Akhenaten's legacy and restored the religious order that had existed for millennia. But erasure, as subsequent pharaohs would discover, required more than simply reversing policies. It required actively attacking Akhenaten's memory, chiselling his name from monuments, destroying his images, removing him from the historical record entirely. The attempt to make him disappear would paradoxically preserve his significance for future generations. After Tutankhamun's death, power eventually passed to the general who had quietly orchestrated much of the restoration, Horemheb. He had served in the military during Akhenaten's reign, watching from the margins as the empire weakened and religious upheaval consumed the government's attention. Now, as pharaoh, he moved to complete what Tutankhamun's advisors had begun, not merely reversing Akhenaten's policies, but erasing him from history entirely. And this was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, a deliberate attempt to obliterate someone's existence from the historical record. Horemheb ordered Akhenaten's name chiselled from every monument where it appeared. His statues were smashed into fragments. His reliefs were defaced. Anywhere his image survived, it was destroyed or covered over. The intensity of this erasure went beyond normal political rivalry. This was an attempt to retroactively annihilate a reign. Official king lists were rewritten. These inscriptions, carved in temples to record the succession of pharaohs, simply skip from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb himself. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and the brief intermediate rulers disappeared entirely. The official chronology suggested that Horemheb had succeeded Amenhotep III immediately, as if the intervening decades had never occurred. The fiction was maintained for generations. Later pharaohs, when they needed to refer to Akhenaten at all, called him the criminal or the rebel of Akhetaten. His actual name was too dangerous to write. The city of Amarna became a convenient quarry. Its temples and palaces were systematically dismantled. The finely cut stone blocks, talatat, were transported to other sites and reused in new construction. Ironically, this reuse would later help archaeologists, as many blocks were incorporated into later buildings where they survived, preserving fragments of Amarna's reliefs and inscriptions. But at the time, the message was clear. Even the physical structures of Akhenaten's revolution would be erased and repurposed, transformed into foundations for the restored traditional order, and yet the political repairs extended beyond mere symbolism. The priesthood of Amun was restored to its former wealth and influence. Temples received generous donations to compensate for the years of neglect. The religious establishment that Akhenaten had tried to dismantle was rebuilt, perhaps even stronger than before, its survival having proved the futility of challenging its authority. Military reorganization became a priority. Egypt's reputation as a regional power needed restoration. Horemheb launched campaigns to reassert Egyptian control over territories that had slipped away during Akhenaten's reign. He restructured the army, appointed new commanders, and worked to rebuild the military prestige that had eroded through 2 decades of neglect. Diplomatic relationships required careful rebuilding, and the Hittites had expanded their influence during Egypt's distraction. Client states had learned that Egyptian protection couldn't be relied upon. Trust, once broken, took generations to restore. The empire Akhenaten had inherited, wealthy, stable, respected, had been severely damaged. His successors would spend decades repairing the diplomatic and military foundations he had allowed to crumble. Yet for all the violence of the erasure, it failed in a fundamental way. The very thoroughness of the destruction testified to Akhenaten's importance. You don't systematically obliterate someone insignificant. You don't rewrite official histories to exclude someone who didn't matter. You don't chase down every inscription, every image, every mention of someone unless their impact was profound. Yet the holes left in the historical record pointed to something missing. Later scholars, even in antiquity, noticed the gaps. They wondered about the damaged inscriptions, the reused blocks covered with unfamiliar artistic styles, the chronological inconsistencies in the king lists, and when modern archaeologists began excavating in Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found Amarna. The city that had been abandoned and forgotten yielded up its secrets, the distinctive art style, the revolutionary theology, the diplomatic correspondence that revealed an empire in crisis, the clay tablets that had sat in palace archives for over 3,000 years provided direct evidence of what had happened during those erased decades. The boundary stelae, too massive to be completely destroyed, still proclaimed Akhenaten's vision carved into the cliff faces around his abandoned capital. The attempt to erase him had paradoxically preserved him. By trying so hard to eliminate his memory, his enemies had ensured that future generations would ask, who was this king that Egypt worked so desperately to forget? The irony would have appalled Horemheb and his successors. They had wanted Akhenaten obliterated, his reign forgotten, his revolution treated as if it had never occurred. Instead, they had created one of history's greatest mysteries, a pharaoh whose absence from official records made him more intriguing than presence ever could have. Akhenaten's revolution failed, but its consequences rippled through Egyptian history long after his name was chiselled from the monuments. The weakening of imperial control during his reign created vulnerabilities that Egypt would struggle to overcome for generations. The 19th dynasty pharaohs, particularly Seti I and Ramesses II, would spend decades campaigning to restore Egyptian dominance in Syria and Canaan. Their militarism was in part a response to the losses incurred during Akhenaten's neglect. Egypt recovered its power, but the recovery required constant military effort. The empire that Amenhotep III had maintained through diplomacy and prestige now had to be enforced through warfare. The balance had shifted, and Egypt's enemies had learned that the empire could be challenged. Domestically, the religious establishment emerged from the Aten period more entrenched than ever, having survived an existential threat. The priesthood understood their vulnerability and their power. The precedent Akhenaten set for religious centralization, ironically, may have influenced later pharaohs who sought to concentrate authority, even if they did so within the traditional framework rather than against it. The broader historical implications remain subjects of intense debate. Scholars have argued for over a century about whether Akhenaten's theology influenced later developments in monotheistic thought. Did his ideas somehow reach the Levant and contribute to emerging Israelite monotheism? The chronology makes direct influence unlikely, yet the conceptual parallels, exclusive worship of one God, suppression of other deities, universal divine power, are striking. What's undeniable is that Akhenaten demonstrated something unprecedented, that a civilization's entire religious system could be challenged and temporarily overturned through royal decree. The experiment failed, but it proved the possibility. When archaeologists rediscovered Amarna in the late 19th century, they found a time capsule of revolutionary thought. The diplomatic letters, the boundary stelae, the distinctive art, all of it had been preserved by abandonment and erasure. What Egypt tried to forget, the desert remembered. The excavations revealed not just artifacts, but a profound historical irony. The pharaoh who wanted to revolutionize eternity instead became a cautionary tale about the limits of individual vision against institutional power. Akhenaten did not intend to collapse the empire. Records suggest he genuinely believed he was purifying Egypt, elevating it to a higher spiritual plane, freeing it from the corruption of priestly power and the confusion of multiple gods. Instead, he destabilized a religious system that had provided structure and meaning for millennia. He weakened political structures that had maintained Egypt's dominance. He demonstrated that even the most ancient traditions were fragile when confronted with determined ideological change. His legacy is paradoxical. He failed to establish lasting monotheism in Egypt. His capital was abandoned. His name was erased. His revolution was systematically dismantled within a generation of his death. Yet he proved that civilizations could be transformed by ideas, that religious systems were not as eternal as they appeared. That concentrated power in the hands of an ideological ruler could reshape society in profound and unpredictable ways. Egypt's temples would stand again, their columns supporting the same ceilings that had echoed with hymns for thousands of years. The old gods would return to their shrines, their names spoken once more in rituals unchanged since the age of pyramids. Amun would reclaim his throne. Osiris would again rule the underworld. But for 17 years in the 14th century BC, none of that existed. For one brief moment in history, the sun alone ruled the sky. One family stood as the sole channel to the divine. One city embodied a vision of religious purity that rejected everything Egypt had been. And because one king dared to ask whether tradition could be overturned, the course of religious and political history was permanently altered, not through the success of his vision, but through the very fact that he tried. Akhenaten accidentally changed history forever by showing that history could be changed at all.